Hey everybody, Ryan here at eTrailer. Today on our 2020 Chevy Suburban, we're going to be showing you how to install the Air Force One supplemental braking system. But before we do that, why don't we check it out and make sure that this is actually going to work for you. So before we jump right in and start talking about the braking system and how it works and everything like that, I figured it'd be beneficial just to kind of touch base and refresh yourselves on the main parts that we're going to need to flat tow our vehicle down the road in the first place. So there's going to be a total of 5 main components needed to flat tow your Chevy down the road safely. First one's going to be the base plate, and that's going to provide us with a solid and reliable attachment point. That way we can hook our tow bar up to it. The tow bar is going to be the second component, and this is going to be the physical link that actually connects the front of your vehicle to the back of your coach. The third main component will be safety cables, and these are pretty straightforward here. These are just there in the event of an unlikely disconnect. They're going to keep everything paired together. The fourth main component is going to be tow bar wiring, and what this is going to do is transfer the lighting signals from the back of your motorhome to the back of your Suburban. That way people know what's going on behind you and you'll be safe and legal. And last but not least, the fifth main component will be the supplemental braking system. And what this is going to do is apply the brakes in your SUV whenever you hit the brakes in your coach, helping to bring you to a more complete and predictable stop. But with that out of the way, let's talk about braking systems. So braking systems are one of those components that are really important, and you want to make sure you get the right one that's going to work for you. On the same note though, it can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of them out there and can get confusing pretty quick. I know that's how I felt when I first started kind of dealing with a lot of these flat tow products. But with that said, I'm going to try to simplify it a little bit for you. So with the Air Force One, this is going to be a permanent type system. So it's going to stay with your vehicle. And this is going to work for those of you that have motorhomes with air brakes. This is a really awesome system, one of the top ones definitely that I recommend for motorhomes with air brakes, and that's because it's super reliable, rarely come across any issues with them, and extremely easy to set up. Once it's installed, a couple things to do, a couple things to connect here, and that's it. So anyone can figure it out for sure. With that said though, if you have a motorhome that has hydraulic brakes, so you're just classic brakes, the Air Force One is going to work for you. One that I always recommend for those of you that have the hydraulic brakes would be the Stay and Play Duo. Again, it's a permanent type system. It'll stay with it, and same holds true for that system. Really reliable. We've had a lot of luck with them. Super easy to set up. Essentially, you just got to turn it on, and that's really about it. And then you have portable type braking systems, and these definitely have their place. With the portable type, the one that I always like to recommend is the Blue Ox Patriot 3. It's just a good system. It works. It fits in a lot of floorboards. It's light, easy to figure out. On that note, though, a portable type system, you're going to have to set it up and take it out every time you want to flat tow or disconnect and drive your truck around. Not really a huge deal, but it is a couple steps involved to do that. But the benefit is you're not going to have a permanent type system, and that Patriot 3, that's going to work with motorhomes that have air brakes and hydraulic brakes. So whatever you got there, you're going to be covered. So that's a really good choice for those of you that might only flat tow every now and again, or change vehicles pretty often, or even have a couple of vehicles. If you have two, you can use that one braking system and kind of put it, take it in and out of one, and save you some cash there. So regardless of your situation, there's going to be an option for you that'll work out really well. So I talked about how easy it is to set this braking system up, the Air Force One. And obviously once all of your other components are hooked up, all you're going to need to do is hook up your airline as well as your breakaway switch tether. So Air line goes to the fitting on the back of your motorhome. Breakaway switch tether goes to your motorhome's hitch. And these just plug in. So it'll plug into the air in fitting here. And this one just clips to the breakaway switch there. So that's all there is to it. You don't have to turn the system on or adjust anything. Nothing like that. So, you know, it doesn't take hardly any time out of your day, and it's really hard to mess something up here. So simplicity is good, really straightforward, and it's really going to help eliminate the chances of making any mistakes. Since we're right here, I might as well elaborate on the breakaway switch. So this is just going to be a safety device, and what happens is, say if you were to accidentally become disconnected from your motorhome, this pin will pull out, it'll activate the braking system and apply the brakes in the Suburban, just to help kind of get things back under control. So one of the really good benefits to the Air Force One is the fact that it is a truly proportional braking system. So more or less what that means is however hard you apply the brakes in your motorhome, that's how hard the brakes are going to be applied in your towed vehicle. So what that's going to do is make for a smooth experience. You know, you want that whenever you're driving down the road. It's already a lot to manage a big motorhome with a towed vehicle. You know, there's a lot going on, and so having that proportional braking system, you're not going to feel the car wanting to kind of drag you down or push against the back of your motorhome, if that makes sense. So to kind of give you an example on how that would work, let's say maybe you're rolling up to a stoplight up ahead, and you're just kind of on the brakes like you normally would be. Towed vehicle is going to do the same thing. On the other hand, let's say if you're going down the highway and there's an accident up ahead, and you really have to stand on that brake pedal and mat it down to the ground. The towed vehicle is going to do the same thing. So at the end of the day, like I said, it's going to be a lot smoother, much more predictable, and provide you with a controlled braking experience. System's also going to have an indicator light. So whenever the brake pedal is applied in your towed vehicle, that light's going to come on. And that's just a real quick way to kind of keep an eye on things, make sure it's working properly, especially if you have an observation camera on the back of your motorhome. Daytime, it's kind of tricky to see, but at nighttime, you can usually see it pretty clearly. So a nice touch, and just helps instill a little more confidence in you whenever you're flat towing. But other than that, at the end of the day, if your motorhome has air brakes, like I said before, this is one I definitely recommend. Just flat out works. You know, there's really no other way around it. Now, as far as the installation goes, I'm not gonna lie, it's definitely time consuming. Not so much really difficult or complex in those terms. It just takes up your time. You know, you have some work to do on the vehicle side as well as the motorhome side. So definitely set aside a good day probably to get this done, but you do it once and it's done. You know, you don't have to mess with it again. But speaking of that, why don't we go ahead and do that together now. To begin our install on our Chevy, first thing we're going to be doing is mounting up a few of our main components. The first two being the breakaway switch and our air valve here. So I went ahead and did that, and this is how they turned out. We'll get to the breakaway switch in a minute, but for now we'll focus on this. All I did, you can actually unscrew this from each other because it comes with a bracket. Took the bracket off, drilled a small hole in the plastic there, and put our fitting through, where we're able to now go underneath and tighten it down. But I just wanted to give you a visual on how this looks. So with that said, let's go underneath and take a better look at how everything's actually bolted up and everything. So here is a little better look at the back of that air fitting. Like I said, you can just use your wrenches to tighten everything down to keep it snug. And then I took some of the included airline and just plugged that airline into the back of the fitting. I'll show you how that works and everything here in a moment when we have kind of a easier spot to see it and what's going on with it. But that air fitting, or I'm sorry, that airline tube is going to run kind of up and kind of in this area here. So you see our air tube, and it's going to run up into the engine compartment along with our 2 breakaway switch wires. So those are going to follow it up. But kind of getting on that, we'll move back to our breakaway switch. So here's the breakaway switch mounted, and I did have to make a couple of brackets. There was really no other way around it. I just had an S-shaped bracket and bolted the breakaway switch to it. And I just cut off a piece of angle. So this angle piece here, bolted the S-shaped bracket to it, and then used a self-tapper to secure that into the bottom of the frame. So, you know, if you don't have any pieces of metal laying around the house, might not be bad. We actually offer some, they're called no-drill long brackets. Might not be a bad idea to grab one of those, and you will have to bend it and kind of make it yourself, but really not too tricky. No real crazy angles or anything like that. So that's how I got the breakaway switch mounted. But with all that said, down here, why don't we go up top into the engine compartment and take a look at what we got going on up there. So you can see here's our airline tube and our breakaway switch wires that ran up. And the reason we ran them up here is to get them to our main operating unit, which is this component here. And this is how I set this up. There's actually a battery tray that's unused, and I just used some self-tapping screws to secure this down. Keep in mind the length of the screws. Use the short ones because the washer fluid bottle does sit underneath this, so if you get carried away with some long screws, you could drill into it. So just something to think about. From there, since we're right here, we might as well get this out of the way. You're going to have 2 black wires coming out of the operating unit. One of them, doesn't matter which one, will get connected to the black wire from our breakaway switch. And I used a butt connector to pair them 2 together. If you're not familiar or unsure how to use a butt connector, sit tight, we'll go over that in a moment. But that's how I paired it up. And then the other remaining black wire out of the operating unit, that's going to need to get grounded. And so I just ran that wire right over here to a thick part of our body of our vehicle. That'll supply us with a good ground. I just crimped on a ring terminal and used a self-tapping screw to get it secured. So pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy there. And that leaves us with the orange breakaway switch wire, which we'll worry about that here in a moment, and that airline tube. So this airline tube is going to get plugged into the air end fitting on our main operating unit here. So with these, you want to make sure when you cut this to length that the end is clean and straight like this. So you want to use a pair of snips, something like this, to cut that clean. We even offer tubing cutters designed for nylon air tubes like this, or even if you're just really careful and use a razor edge and put it flat on a table or something and cut it. You don't want to use a regular pair of snips because it'll pinch it and potentially create a leak. But once you have that cut to length, really simple. These are push to connect fittings, just like the fitting on the bottom side. You want to do the same thing. That's how all of them are going to get hooked up. But these are simply just going to push right into place and they'll lock in. So really all there is to it there. Now what we can do is work on our actual vacuum line. So you're going to take the length of hose they give you and one of the check valves. And on the hose here, if you kind of bend it, it makes it a little more malleable and easier to work with. But I'm going to straighten up that end. Then go about 3 inches or so, something like that. I'm going to cut off that. Then you're going to take the check valve and on one of the ends, put the black end of the check valve in. We can take this and actually move it down to our main operating unit. There will be a barbed fitting labeled vacuum. Pretty straightforward here. We're just going to push that on to it. And this will get us kind of ready for what we're going to do next. In my experience, it's easier just to do the small piece first as opposed to trying to do everything at the same time. So now we can get a few more things ready. What you're going to do is cut off maybe a 2-inch piece of rubber hose, if that. You're going to take the other check valve, and if you're looking at it like this, I'm going to put the white end of the check valve in, and eventually when we get this all in, the black side of the check valve is going to face towards the engine. And then you're going to take your T and work that end to the other end. And the reason we're doing this, kind of like the other one, it's easier just to kind of pick away at this and drop everything in at once. So with this setup now, we can come down to our main vacuum line, which is this plastic line here. So this is going to be coming off of your brake booster. And thankfully it's pretty straight and open, relatively easy to work with. I'm not sure how we're going to do this yet, but we'll figure it out. I'm going to go like right here in the center of the straight part and just cut it. And from here we can figure out what fittings we need and what we're going to do. So what I think we're going to do is that line here I cut out maybe 2 inches total, and this looks like it's going to work. So on the end you're going to take one of your hose clamps and just slide that on, and then our check valve here, the side that's going closest to the engine, I think we can just work this in. It's plastic, and that's actually a really tight fit, so that should work out really well. Try to straighten that out. And then we're also going to grab another clamp for this side and do the same thing with our T. We'll get that pushed all the way on. These are so tight, I don't even know if we need the clamp, but better be safe than sorry. Come back and tighten these down. And when you're tightening these down, I mean, you don't have to give it everything you have. Just make sure it's snug, and that'll do the trick. So the only thing left to do, we have that last T, that last fitting coming up. You're going to take the rest of your vacuum tubing, push that over onto it. And I already cut this a length, maybe a couple foot. The other end is just going to go onto the check valve here, go into our main operating unit. So moving back here to our operating unit, we're going to have another wire that we need to hook up. So this orange wire that's coming from our breakaway switch, what you're going to do is strip back the insulation on that, and then you're going to take the included bundle of brown wire, strip back the insulation on it, and you're going to connect both ends into one side of a butt connector. The brown wire will eventually run inside, which we'll get to in a second, but what I've done here is taken an extra length of wire. In our case, it just happens to be black. And this is going to run over to our power source, so over by our battery. So this just kind of runs along the edge and then along the back side of our firewall. So all the way over and drops out or comes out over towards the passenger side. So here's our black wire, and we need to connect it to a fuse holder. So I'm going to strip back the insulation. And since our fuse holder has a lot thicker gauge wire, I'm just going to twist this and double it back to kind of make it fit better. And what you're going to do is take a butt connector, Slide it over the bare end and crimp it down. I'm using heat shrink butt connectors. They just provide us with a little more protection against corrosion, and so if you'd rather use them, you can always grab them here at eTrailer. Make sure it's not going anywhere. And then we're going to take the included fuse holder. So first things first, pop it open, make sure the fuse is not installed. That's the last thing we're going to do here on our vehicle. But you're going to cut that in half and strip the ends back on this as well. One end you're going to put on a ring terminal. Crimp it down. The other end here, I'll get that stripped back. Should probably cut it down a little bit. And this is going to get connected into the other end of the butt connector there. And once I have this crimped, since this is a heat shrink, I will grab my heat source and seal up the ends. So with this ready to go, you have a couple choices here. So you can hook this directly up to your 12-volt battery, or in our case, we have a battery disconnect. And so I'm just going to hook it up here. It's a little easier to get to. And if you do this, just make sure you hook it up to the hot side of your battery disconnect. So that would be this post here. So what I'm going to do is remove our nut. I think this is a 13mm socket that I'm using, or wrench rather. And obviously when you're doing this, you don't want this to have power to it just yet, so make sure it's disconnected from the battery. We'll pull that hardware off, take our ring terminal, slide that over the post, and put our hardware back on. Now we can start to route some things inside. So one of them being an airline tube. So this is going to get connected to the air out port on your operating unit. The brown wire that we talked about is going to go inside. And while we're right here, I also set up an additional ground wire. And just doing it this way makes it a little easier. So I just used a length of white wire, maybe 5 foot long, crimped on a ring terminal and attach it to that ground that we already had done. So the tube and our 2 wires, they're going to run towards our firewall. And right here in this area, there's a grommet that you can use to get everything inside. So here's that grommet that we used. Where the wires are going through, there's actually a factory nipple. So you can take a pair of snips and cut that nipple off, and that will allow us to simply just push everything through. There's already a hole there and everything else. So cut off the end of that nipple, and that'll give us the space that we need to push our wires and our tubing through. When you're doing that, it's pretty tight underneath and kind of hard to get lined up. So what I did was tape everything up together, the tube and the wires, and I just put some soapy water on them to help glide them through and make it easier to get inside. Now here inside of our vehicle, underneath the dash, here's where our tubing and our 2 wires come out. I will say it's pretty tight up there, so you know, you might have to really kind of dig your hand up there and help guide these wires down. With that said though, before we hook these up, we have to do a couple other things, so why don't we go ahead and knock that out now. So one of the things that we can do now is get our indicator light set up, which is this piece here. So I just stuck that to the back of our plastic rear view mirror housing, I guess you'd call it. It's just sticky tape on the light, so clean everything off real good. Stick it on there, and there is a wire that comes off of it, and that's going to have to get routed down to the driver's side floorboard. So what I've done is just ran it along through here and pushed it up along this edge. So the wire is going to run up through here, and I just tucked it in, so you can kind of just jam it in there. And then underneath the headliner, there's a small gap, and you can simply just kind of push that wire along this whole edge. And then our A-pillar, so where this piece of plastic meets, you can kind of pull that out, do the same thing, just jam that wire in there. And then along this whole edge, so the weather stripping, you can peel that back and do the same thing, just tuck that wire in there. And I did that all the way down along through here, and once I got to this point here, I just pushed the wire back, and this is where it came out. So now we can get our actuator cylinder installed, which is this component here. This just clamps to the brake pedal arm, and what we're looking for is the cable that comes off the back of it. That's going to get attached to the firewall, or anchored to the firewall, and what we're looking for is that cable to have a straight shot at it. So that'll give us the best performance. I used the included support bracket, so on each side of it I used self-tapping screw to run into the firewall. There's really not a lot on the other side of the firewall, but be conscious of where you're drilling and screwing into. You don't want to hit anything of importance. And then the center hole I use to attach our anchor to. So the everything's secure now, and you are going to have to adjust the tension on the cylinder, so how much slack is in that cable that goes to the firewall. And you want a little bit of movement. Something like this is usually acceptable. To do that, you can just adjust the cable length to where you need it, and then there's a 4mm hex head set screw that you can tighten down to keep it where it needs to be. And then from there, I hooked up our air line that we ran in here, same way we did the others, cut it clean, plugged it in. And there's a reed switch, which is this wire here. You slide that in the slot and just snug it down. That wire's going to come off and break off into 3 wires. All right. I got these hooked up. The brown wire from the reed switch, that's going to get connected to the brown wire that we ran inside here from the engine compartment. The black wire from the reed switch, that's going to get hooked up to the red wire from our indicator light. And the blue wire from our reed switch, that's going to get connected to the black wire from our indicator light. And I also took, if you remember that extra white wire that we grounded in the engine compartment and ran in here, I stuffed that into this end of the butt connector as well. So that's how all these are set up. So all that's left to do on our vehicle side now is simply take our fuse and put it into the included holder. And if you need to do the motorhome, you can hang around. We'll show you how we're going to do ours. If not, that's really all there is to it. To begin our installation on our motorhome, first thing we're going to do is mount up our air fitting here at the back. And all I've done was taken the bracket, just zipped a couple self-tapping screws into essentially the side of our hitch. So that's really all there is to it there. It's nice and secure and easy to get to. So now what we can do is move underneath of our motorhome, and keep in mind, you know, these are all set up a little bit different. So use this as just kind of a guide. If yours looks a little different, don't be surprised. But with that said, we're right behind our rear axle and need to mount up your tank. In our case, we have this cross beam that runs across our frame rails, and it has a bunch of holes already in it. Turned out that those holes lined up with the holes in our bracket. So I just used some nuts and bolts to secure it. And I mean, it's not going anywhere. And think about it, you know, when you're mounting this thing up, you don't want it to be in the way of anything or close to the ground or anything like that. So this is about as good as it gets. Up nice and high, centered, out of the way. With that said, we're gonna have 3 air lines that we need to hook up. The first one that we're gonna do is this one here coming out of this elbow. And when you hook these up, just like your vehicle side, you know, make sure the lines are cut clean and straight, and they just plug right into these quick connect fittings. So this one here is going to run straight back to the rear of our motorhome, where we just mounted up our air fitting back there. So straight shot right on back, avoid any hot or moving parts, use a couple zip ties to keep it secure. And the end of this line is going to get plugged into that air fitting the same way. It's just another quick connect. So cut it, plug it right in. For our other 2 air lines, what I've done is I had probably 15 foot left of the airline tubing. I stretched it out and just cut it in half. One end I'm going to plug in into here. All right, and this is going to go to our metered air. The other end will plug into this side, and this is going to go to our supply air. Not a bad idea either. I don't know. So say like one of those nylon tubes, if you want to put a piece of tape on each end or paint it, I put some white paint there just to keep them organized and know which one goes to what. So in our case, my line with the white paint is our metered air, so it'll be easy to identify that when we're ready to hook it up. And the reason I'm doing this is so we can run both these at the same time and we're not backtracking. So both of our airline tubes run straight up and essentially just straight through, straight along the bottom side of our motorhome, just in front of our rear axle, where all of our brake and airline components meet up. So first thing we're going to worry about is hooking up our metered air. So in our case, it's this line right here. So this is going to be the line that comes out of your main valve and runs over to a secondary valve. And the metered air, you're only going to get air pressure coming out of that when the brakes are applied. So a quick way to check is if you undo this line, these are all quick connect fittings just like the other ones. If you undo the line, have someone push a brake, you'll get air pressure coming out of it. So that's a quick way to identify it. A lot of times it's going to be 3/8 in diameter, the hose is, and that's what ours is. And so you're going to cut that in half, just like how we've been cutting the airline. Take the included T-fitting, clip those in, and then on the top of the T, simply just plug in the metered airline that we have ran back from our tank. Now we can hook up our supply line. So traditionally this is going to be the fattest line coming straight from your air tank. In our case, it's this one here. Now before you get to cutting this, make sure to drain all your air pressure, because if you have 100 plus PSI in here and you cut this line, it's not going to be a fun day. But what you want to do is, quickest way, you can just hit your brake pedal a whole bunch with the motorhome off, and that'll drain all the air pressure out. Cut your supply line, put in your T, and then plug in the air fitting, plug in the air line to the last fitting that's coming from our tank. I will say with this particular model, I did have to get a different T fitting. The kit does come with a 5/8 T, and that's the majority of the airlines. This one was a 1/2 inch size, so something to think about. You could probably pick these up online. They're just DOT fittings, or heavy equipment stores, so something like that. You can grab these, but that's how I did it. And once everything's done, what we want to do is start the motorhome back up, let it build air pressure, hit the brakes a handful of times, let it fill up again, shut the motorhome down, and then you want to come and check for any leaks. So All the fittings that we mess with, you want to not only listen for an air leak, but you can spray it down with soapy water as well. And if you're getting a bunch of bubbles constantly forming, that's going to indicate an air leak. And if that's the case, drain the tanks again, take the lines out, recut them clean, and do that process again. And as long as your lines are cut clean and everything, you shouldn't run into any issues, but it's always good to double check.
Okay, here we are with Gary and Phillips, and we're going to go over their flat toe setup with them today, show them how everything works and where we installed everything on the Suburban. So it's a 2020 Suburban.
C71.
Yeah, so really nice truck. So first of all, we've got the system all put on here, so I'll show you where everything is. So the guys hide things pretty well, and they do a lot of good work as far as putting wire loom all over everything and making it all really nice. So this is your battery disconnect, and that's the part that there's a momentary switch inside. We'll show you here in just a minute. And then this here is your fuse for your braking system. So if the braking system's ever just not working, this is the first place to check.
Okay.
And you just pop the top off and the fuse is inside there. And then the Air Force One is over here in the secondary battery tray location. So some of these trucks are diesel, so they have a second battery location usually, but since you don't have the second battery and you have the gas motor, that's your Air Force One right there. It ties into your vacuum booster right here with this hose. And then that's the only thing that actually ties into any systems on the car is that vacuum right there for the vacuum booster. Everything else is just the braking system itself and power from the battery over there.
Okay.
So then inside the car here, I'll show you the breakaway or the switch for the solenoid. It's really hard to see, so I'm going to point at it, and then I'll let you get in here and look at it. It has a chrome bezel around it, so you'll be able to see it. But when you press it, you can kind of hear it.
I did,
Okay, so if you want
And when you
to
press
check
on
it out
that,
there. So that's battery off. Everything in the truck went off.
Okay.
And you press it again and it's battery on.
Okay.
So that's that. And then on, if you want to fly in there, on the brake pedal, you'll see a big cylinder and a cable that pulls the brake pedal to the floor. And since you have adjustable pedals, always when you're setting up to tow, you want to adjust the pedals all the way out.
Okay.
That way the pedals, whenever they're adjusted to any other person at any place, it can never affect driving the car.
Okay.
So that's why we do it all the way out. And then other than that, we've got your tow bar and safety cables here. So we've got some really big safety cables because of the weight of the Suburban. And then the tow bar is pretty simple to use. When they're new, they're a little stiff to move. You move them like this. If you're going to store it, you can store it either way. Most people will grab a tow bar cover and just kind of get everything up in the cover and just leave it on the motorhome when they're camping. And then, you know, it'd be good to take it off and store it, like if you're not going to be going anywhere for a long period of time.
Right.
Just to keep it out of the sun and whatnot. This is your airline cable for your braking system, and here's your breakaway cable for the braking system. So we'll just go ahead and get it hooked up. I'll let you do that side, I'll do this side. Just pick it up, get it to where it'll swing down, and then just pull them apart. And then this pin comes out, and you want to always go your pin outside in so that your pin goes through here.
Outside to in.
Yeah. And I guess before we get too far there, I'll show you over here. So to remove this, these when you're not towing and you're just driving around town, you just pull this pin and turn. So you just pull out on the pin, turn, and it'll pop right out.
All right.
And then to put it back in, you don't have to pull on the ring or anything. You just push it in and turn, and you feel it lock in. So that's good. And you always want these ears to the inside.
Okay.
And you just put it there. Go through there and make sure your snapper pin goes through there, and make sure this always snaps down. And you want to keep your fingers out of the way because that hurts.
Okay.
I've done that a lot of times on tractors. Then you've got your 6 round, and the only thing I want to point out there is there's a ridge. That ridge is always 12 o'clock.
Okay.
And that runs the lighting and gives you your brake signal for the braking system. And it runs through the tow bar here and goes to the 7-way and plugs right into the 7-way. And we've tested all that, made sure everything was working. The only other thing is the safety cables. Now this is a Blackhawk tow bar. And if you ever decide to tow a smaller vehicle, you can run the safety cables through this channel that's on here that this straight cables ran through. But since these cables are heavy duty for the weight of the Suburban, you're not going to be able to do that. And these hooks are awful large for the safety chain loops that they give you here on the base plate.
Okay.
So we got you these 10,000-pound quick links to attach there. So you just put them in there. And hang on a second, I'm sorry. So sometimes I'm not thinking. You're supposed to cross these cables just in case there ever is a breakaway of the tow bar and the cables are still hooked up. It'll kind of keep the tow bar off the ground and keep it from digging into the ground and causing you a problem. So always make sure that side goes to this side and this side goes to that side. That was my fault. I should have remembered that. And you don't have to tighten these up with a wrench or anything, just finger tights. Really good. They'll actually probably be a little too tight if you run into any rain or road grime or anything. You might need a little pair of pliers to undo them.
Okay.
Then you've got your air line there. I wanted to show the plastic caps. So you got a small cap for the front of the car that you always want to keep on here when you're not towing, and a large cap for this end of the cable for when you're not towing. That keeps all the dirt out of the air system, and then you can stow your cord somewhere. But to go on, it's just like an air compressor chuck there, and then you can do the front side here. And this is one thing I always recommend getting a second set of these. They're just rubber caps for the Air Force, SMI Air Force One.
Okay.
And they just keep the dirt out of the system. And then that's it, except for the breakaway switch, which is right here.
Okay.
And so this is not all the way out yet, so these are plenty. You don't have to worry about wrapping them around the tow bar or anything. They're not going to drag the ground. If you do see them stretching out to where they do get that way, you could throw it around the tow bar one time. Just make sure it's not going to get involved here where it's pivoting and pinch the cables. So on the breakaway, it's just this right here. And this little wire cable needs to always stay on there with that plastic thing to keep the two contacts separated so that it doesn't apply the Air Force One brakes. And this little box here stores some air in case of a breakaway, and then that'll apply the brakes. And then otherwise there's a tank underneath that's tied into your air brakes on the coach that actually works the Air Force One system, so you're not using the air for stopping the coach to stop the car. It's actually auxiliary air that's pushed into that tank while you're just driving along. So, and then yeah, other than that, that's pretty much it for setting up and getting ready to go. Yeah, so that's putting the truck in neutral is always something you always want to use your owner's manual on. So we don't give instruction on that, but we'll go through it with you with your owner's manual, and that's different for every vehicle. So we'll do that here in a minute right before you take off.
All right.
And that should do it.
And that'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system on our 2020 Chevrolet Suburban.